It was a dirty secret. Nobody talked about having mental health issues, problems, and I think it is a really, really positive step forward that we now recognise the parity between mental health and physical health in terms of the focus that we put on it, and also in the need to take away and blast out of the water some of those ridiculous taboos which surrounded this subject for such a long time. As you know, the UK is going to be hosting the COP26 conference later this year. It'll be a strange COP because we will still, although the UK is coming out of the worst of COVID, many countries around the world are still a long way from that point. So it will be a slightly different form of COP, but one of the things we really want it to be is inclusive, to make sure that voices from across the spectrum, not just governments and ministers, are heard loud and clear at COP. So this event is part of our focus here in Canada on making sure we're as inclusive as possible. And obviously, the most important people in this debate are young people, because it's their future, your future, we're talking about. So I'm absolutely delighted to be part of this today, and I'm really looking forward to the conversation. Thank you.
Thank you for those welcoming words, High Commissioner, and for highlighting the importance of these issues and you know, how they're intersecting with our lives and the different levels that we can address these issues. Before we continue, I would like to acknowledge that UBC's campuses are situated on the traditional, ancestral, and unceded homelands of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh, and on the territory of the Silks Okanagan Nation. Indigenous communities have been living and working on these lands since time immemorial, and have experienced extreme violence, displacement, and loss of culture due to settler colonialism. This is included, but is not limited to, forceful seizure of land, ongoing resource extraction violence, systemic genocide through residential school systems, oppression of traditional systems of land, law, culture, and governance, and discriminatory policies resulting in intergenerational poverty, trauma, and disparities in health status. When engaging with issues of climate, mental health, and nature, it is critical to talk about how Indigenous communities locally and globally bear the harmful impacts of climate destruction while being least responsible for the global acceleration of climate change. Further, the Indigenous communities, particularly Indigenous women, have always been at the forefront of climate action and sustainability leadership. The Climate Hub at UBC believes in and is committed to upholding and amplifying Indigenous voices and leadership locally and globally, and showing up in solidarity for Indigenous resistance, resilience, and sovereignty in the face of ongoing environmental racism and dispossession. At the Climate Hub, we are working on more reciprocal relationships with the lands and communities we engage with near and far, and upholding the United Nations Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. We recognize that this work is intersectional, it's individual, it's collective, it's systemic, and it's ongoing. I know folks are also joining us from many places today. So I would like to acknowledge the caretakers of those lands and invite you to share whose lands you're on and where you're joining us from today. And if you're not sure, you can explore this at nativeland.ca, which I think Rachel will put in the chat for folks as well. And now, before we turn to some audience participation, because we're going to kind of call you all in to get involved as well, I would like to introduce our amazing panel of speakers to bring them into the room as we start to think about and engage with the topics and themes of nature, mental health, and climate action today. I'll highlight each speaker in the order that they'll be presenting in today. First up is Dr. Maxime Boivin. Dr. Boivin is a climate change researcher at the Institut National de Santé Publique de Québec, an associate professor at Laval University, and co-director of the EcoEngagement research team, which focuses on ecoanxiety and its relations to environmental engagement and well-being. Welcome, it's nice to have you here with us today. You want to give folks a wave? Maya Rose Craig is a prominent blogger who is also well known as Bird Girl. Maya Rose is a naturalist and conservationist campaigning for equal access to nature for visible ethnic minority folks, and an influential advocate for climate action, global climate justice, Indigenous rights, and stopping biodiversity loss. Welcome, Maya. Maya Rose, nice to have you with us today. Chuck Odenigbo is founding, I'm not sure if I pronounced that correctly, Chuck Odenigbo. Is that better? Thank you. Okay. Is founding director for Future Ancestor Services, an Indigenous and Black-owned youth-led enterprise advancing climate justice and equity with a sense of with a lens of anti-racism and ancestral accountability. He's also co-founder of The Poison and the Apple, a bilingual nonprofit organization seeking to change how Canadians interact with nature at a sociocultural level to diversify outdoor spaces. Welcome. Nice to have you here with us. And we have Emily Bahobo, Emily Bahobo Dombakse Dola. Emily, I hope that was okay. Yeah, okay. Emily is the Storytelling Program Director of Youth for Nature. They are active in the climate and environmental justice movement with a focus on policy and advocacy issues around livelihoods and food systems, adaptation, resilience, intersectionality, and just transition. Welcome, Emily. Nice to have you here with us today. And we have George Radner, the Executive Director at Be the Change Earth Alliance, a charity that delivers environmental and social justice education in British Columbia high schools. He also co-leads a climate storytelling workshop program at the Climate Hub at UBC that seeks to combat the paralyzing effects of eco-anxiety. Nice to have you with us here today. So with that, welcome everybody. We're happy to have you with us today in the room to explore these issues. And so I welcome you all to the room today, the audience included. It's such a pleasure to have you all here for this event. But before we dig deeper into the discussion with our guest speakers, we want to turn to you, the audience, to ask a few questions on issues of eco-anxiety and issues of climate hope. To do this, we're going to be using the menti.com. So we're going to use the Menti platform. Rachel has put the link in the chat. You can open a new tab or do this on your phone. Once you are at menti.com, it will ask you to enter a code. And if you look in the chat function, there is a code in there. If you enter that code, then you should have a screen that comes up that you can interact with, and it will have bars that you can enter your kind of thoughts and words into that. And so the first question that we're going to have you interact with, and I'm just going to say the code out loud, actually, just so folks have that as well. It's 28820082. And so what we want to ask folks is, what does eco or climate anxiety mean to you? Impacts that come to mind might be emotional, psychological, social, medical, physical, economic, political, whatever pops into your head when you think about eco or climate anxiety. There's no right or wrong. We just kind of want to get a feeling of how folks might be thinking about this and feeling about this as we move into today's discussion. So what we'll see on the screen is, as folks enter kind of access Menti, get there, I know it can be a bit of a process, but we'll start seeing what folks are adding into this kind of word cloud that we're seeing here. And one of the things is larger words will be words that multiple folks have entered. The other thing I want to be conscious of is how that scope grows, the many, many different things that people are articulating and the different ways that this is impacting our lives, our communities, our mental health and well-being. And as we see right now, fear is in the middle of that word cloud. Overwhelming, despair, paralysis. Get closer so I can read. Sadness, apocalypse, racism, dread. So as folks are entering this cloud is growing. And again, those larger words are ones that multiple folks have entered. So it gives us a sense of, you know, we're not alone in feeling these things. A lot of folks are when we think of eco or climate anxiety, these are common factors that people are experiencing. And so this is rippling across our communities. This is rippling across our workplaces and environments and that kind of thing as well. So we're going to do this again, but we're going to ask you a bit of a different question this time. So we're going to ask you a different question that has to do with hope. What gives you hope when thinking about issues of climate change? So we've already got some folks putting some in here. What gives you hope? This is kind of the flip side to anxiety. We want to also understand that there's hope out there, that there is room for optimism and room for hope and room for joy in mobilizing around and thinking about and engaging with issues of climate change and the many things that come along with that. So what gives you hope in thinking about issues of climate change? And we see folks entering things like community. That's a really strong central word there that a lot of folks are entering. Collaboration, youth, activism, innovation, technology, fight, land back. So again, if we look at the scope of this cloud, we see such a wide array of things being articulated as hopeful. So there's a lot of room for hope in the actions that we're doing, and there's a lot of different things that we can connect with for these different issues when we're thinking about addressing and engaging with climate action, nature, and mental health. And I love that community is at the center of that right now. So thank you everyone for adding in your thoughts on that and providing us with an insight into your thoughts and feelings when it comes to issues of climate anxiety and climate hope. So I think it's a helpful starting point for us to think about kind of how the audience is thinking about climate anxiety and issues of climate hope as well. So, you know, with that, I think what we can do now is transition into our panel discussion. And so what I will do is I'm going to hand it over to Dr. Maxime Boivin to help us explore eco-anxiety and the mental health impacts of climate change. So Maxime, over to you.
Hi, thank you so much for having me here today. It's a real pleasure to be able to exchange with my fellow panelists and with everyone present today on such an important topic. Today, I want to talk to you a bit more about eco-anxiety because, as we know, eco-anxiety is a growing phenomenon. For instance, in the US, more than 1 in 5 people said that they were very worried about climate change in 2017, a proportion that was twice as high as it was in 2015. In France, this proportion reached upwards of 40% in 2019. The same upward trend is also found here in Canada. For instance, a recent Quebec survey indicated that 34% of respondents felt powerless regarding climate change. In addition, 24% felt guilty for the role they played in the climate crisis, and just as many felt fear towards the current situation. However, what we don't clearly know is what is eco-anxiety and how can we cope with it? Which is why I thought it was so interesting to hear you all talk or write about what eco-anxiety means to you, how you're coping with it and everything. And it's exactly what we're doing in the eco-engagement research team right now. We're talking to people with pro-environmental attitudes and trying to see, first and foremost, if they suffer from eco-anxiety, what it stems from, so what the sources of that eco-anxiety are, how eco-anxiety is affecting them, so the consequences, and finally, how they're coping with their eco-anxiety and where it leads them. The project is still in the early phases, so we don't have empirical results yet. However, we're almost through a vast literature review, which allowed us to paint the first draft of the eco-anxiety conceptual framework with which we'll be working. So without going into too much detail, we found that, well, first and foremost, eco-anxiety is real and it's associated with various consequences on many levels. Why do I take the time to say that eco-anxiety is real? Well, it's because with everyone we've been talking to, militants and everything, we've noticed that eco-anxiety has not yet been widely acknowledged. And so it's important to say that we acknowledge it, that it is something that is real. And probably some of you will find yourselves in the different consequences I'm about to mention. So feel free to interact with that and share whatever consequences you feel your eco-anxiety has created for you. Some of the consequences we've been able to observe are at the emotional level, where things such as sadness, anger, existential anguish, fear have been observed. At the cognitive level as well, where consequences such as ruminations, intrusive thoughts, panic attacks are noticed by researchers. At the interpersonal level as well, where conflicts and isolation may arise, and as well on the physical level with consequences such as exhaustion or sleep disorder, for instance. That's all because the growing awareness of the risks associated with climate change represent a challenge for psychological and collective well-being. Many are deeply affected by a sense of loss, helplessness, frustration at their inability to make things happen. Being constantly surrounded by complex, threatening, and uncertain issues, which is a perception that is fueled notably by media coverage, can lead to such a form of psychological distress. Now, eco-anxiety seems to lead in many ways to discouragement, a feeling of helplessness, or even eco paralysis. These fears and anxieties can lead to pessimism and inaction, indeed, even going as far for some people as abandoning their dream of having children, for instance. However, others also argue that concerns about the planet can be positive. As a matter of fact, even though some forms of eco-anxiety can be pathological, other forms can be constructive, leading to favorable pro-environmental attitudes and behaviors, for instance. Some studies have even argued that eco-anxiety can be a driver of action and citizen involvement, which in turn can lower eco-anxiety. As a matter of fact, many coping skills we found in the literature are related to civic engagement, both individually and collectively. Other fun facts, since the theme of this panel focuses on the relationship between nature and mental health and climate action, another recurring theme among coping strategies is the importance of our connection to nature. Our connection to nature helps explain our eco-anxiety in a way, but it also helps soothe it, and it encourages implication in the fight against climate change. In addition, we know that maintaining a good relation to nature, whether it be just being surrounded by nature, as was mentioned previously, is beneficial for our health, as it helps notably with mental health problems and tends to boost physical activity. To conclude and let the other panelists share their thoughts with you, I'd just like to remind you that the line between eco-anxiety as a driving force for climate action and inaction is quite thin, as we can notably see with militant fatigue and discouragement, for example. So please watch out for yourselves. Thank you.
Thank you. I think that's a great starting point for us to start thinking about the intersection of these issues. Wonderful. Thank you so much. So next, Maya Rose, we'll turn to you.
Thank you so much. Let's talk a little bit about just that link between mental health and nature and well-being. Because they have a charity called Black to Nature, which we've been running for about 6 years now. And this charity is about working with kids from ethnic minority backgrounds and taking them out into the countryside and giving them that opportunity to engage with nature. And this is like possibly a very UK-centric issue, but there are a lot of problems within the UK, and I suspect within a lot of other Western countries, where for a lot of people who live in urban areas, it's very, very difficult to access nature, and it's very, very difficult to access the country. And I would go so far as to say that in the UK, at least, it is a privilege to have access to green spaces where you need enough time and money and resources, and quite often have to be of a certain class. And so we spend a lot of time working with kids from these various backgrounds, because we feel like that connection to nature is incredibly important, especially in a period where a lot of people have lost that. Especially because the NHS, our health services in the UK, have officially acknowledged that green prescribing is a very effective way to deal with mental health issues. So when you have that going on, it is seen as quite shocking that people don't have that connection to nature. There are also within the UK a lot of mental health issues within different ethnic minority communities. They make up about 60% of the people that are sectioned in the UK, despite making up about 12% of the population. There are some really major mental health issues going on. And again, we feel like working with these kids is really important, because a lot of what we do is, while creating this connection to nature, just doing some really fun activities with kids in the countryside. We're giving young people the tools to manage their own well-being, and highlighting for them, letting them mentally make that connection between nature and well-being. And I feel like that's going to be something that's incredibly important to younger generations going forward, especially as we are dealing with an increase in mental health issues in general, but also things like eco-anxiety. Another reason that the work is incredibly important is because within the UK, there are very certain groups of people who connect with nature, but also are connected with climate change and the environmental movement. And that is quite often people who are very white and very middle class. And so we feel like working with kids and having, again, very, very honest conversations about the future of the planet and the future of like what we're dealing with going forward is incredibly important, especially when, you know, we've got issues like eco-anxiety. We're still not really having those honest conversations with kids. And I'm very worried about going over, but essentially what I'm trying to say is I feel like these three issues are so totally interconnected, and that in general, I feel like intersectionality is so important, where you can't really start to tackle one until you've started tackle. I certainly feel that people have very little capacity to care about environmental issues when they've never really experienced nature or the outdoors. And so I totally feel that going forward,
We've just lost the connection, Maya Rose, quickly there, but it might come back.
hello?
There you are. Yeah. There you are. You just cut out for a moment. Yeah. You
Sorry,
can
my
finish up that last
internet's
point.
unstable.
Yeah.
I only had a few words left anyway. Sorry. I was just going to say that I feel like tackling these as a three-headed sort of beast going forward is how we're going to start engaging more and more people with the climate movement, while also tackling lots of the mental health issues that environmental issues have been causing. But I'm very excited to hear what everyone else has to say.
No, thank you so much for all those really great points and connections. And I really love how you noted, be honest with children. They can take they understand what's going on, and just having that conversation. So I think that's a great point to make. And so next, Chuck, will you be able to jump in on that and move us forward on that?
Absolument, absolument. Bonjour tout le monde, je m'appelle Chuck. Hi everyone, my name is Chuck. Je suis ravi d'être devant vous aujourd'hui. It's really exciting to hear my co-panelists speak, and I'm really excited to hear the co-panelists who come after me speak as well. So when we talk about eco-anxiety, there's a couple of things that come to mind immediately. The first thing that comes to mind is the individualization of societal issues. So kind of as Dr. Boivin a mentionné. Whoa, switching between languages, give me a second. So kind of like Dr. Boivin mentioned, the thing about climate is that it's not all up to the individual. And I think we've perpetuated this myth that it's up to the individual, because it's a lot easier to put the blame on people than it is to sit down and, modify systems, change the status quo, fight corporations, all that fun stuff. And so, I think COVID has been something that has hopefully opened a lot of people's eyes, because during the first couple months of COVID, where literally the world shut down, people weren't flying, people weren't driving, people were staying home, we didn't really see that many reduction of emissions. We didn't really see an actual impact. And the reason we didn't see an actual impact is because it's not an individual's fault. It's the societies we live in and the way we've set up and structured our societies and the way they function that create the climate issues that we see today. And so that lack of recognition creates eco-anxiety, because it does a couple of things. One, it makes people feel powerless, because you're seeing these large global things happening, right? When we talk about climate change, and this is the other thing, I think there's also a misunderstanding of climate change. So we always talk about climate change. Climate change is important to talk about. But when we talk about climate change, we talk about it as if it is the problem. But climate change is actually a secondary issue. The main problems are also all these sort of primary issues that we see that coalesce together to create climate change, which is a secondary issue. And so we can't directly tackle climate change, right? We don't have the technology, the means, the know-how to actively change the way in which our climate is responding to things. We can't tackle climate change directly. But what we can do is we can sit down and ask ourselves, what is leading to climate change? It's the rapid urbanization of our societies. It is, as Maya Rose mentioned, the disconnect between our societies and nature. It is racism, it is sexism, it is discarding or dismissing Indigenous peoples. It is, creating society, at least in a Canadian context, creating societies where you need to have a car. If you do not have a car, you are literally not leaving your house. It is all of these different systems that we have sort of in place. And each of these, it's deforestation, it's ocean pollution, and we can tackle those, right? We can tackle ocean pollution. We can address the fact that the commercial fishing industry produces 50% of the plastic waste that we see in the Pacific Ocean. That we can tackle. We can tackle deforestation and really sort of focus on planting more trees and creating more regulations around that. We can fight we can talk about what urbanization means and how we can make our cities greener. We can do all of these we can tackle all these issues that then by addressing these issues, thereby address climate change. So when we think about eco-anxiety, there's this whole idea of like impuissance, like, oh my God, I have no ability, no strength to be able to tackle this issue head on. And the reason you have no strength to tackle the issue head on is because it's impossible to tackle the issue head on. So you have to ask yourself what leads to that issue, so that then we can tackle the issues that create this major issue, so that we're able to then, sort of defeat that issue. So there's that component. The other component is the guilt component. Oh my God, I shouldn't fly. Oh my God, I shouldn't have children. All of these sort of guilt-based components of what am I doing? Am I doing my part, my individual part? And these suggestions, these rhetoric is actually very heavily grounded in racism. And the reason why I say it's heavily grounded in racism is, let's think about the idea of having more kids, for example. When you say, oh, we shouldn't have more kids, we tend to refer to countries where people do have a large number of children. And these tend to be countries that are of lower income. And what's really fascinating is that these countries of lower income per person use a lot fewer resources. They contribute a lot less to the climate change issue than one person in a high income country. And so at that point, when you hear people like Jane Goodall say things like, oh, people should start having less babies across the world, it's an overpopulation thing. It's not. It's a distribution of resources thing. And so it places the burden on people from lower income countries, and that tends to manifest in racism by saying, oh, it's your fault we're experiencing this. So you've got that component. Then you've also got sort of the don't fly component. Now, this is me speaking from a very Canadian context. But imagine saying don't fly in the most multicultural country in the world, where a large chunk of us are first, second, third generation. And so we have family literally all across the world. So to say to someone, don't fly for the sake of the planet, is to say to someone, cut yourself off from your family. Yes, you don't have the privilege of having 10 generations of family in the same town, but do it for the climate. That is inherently racist because it tends to negatively impact a certain group of people over others. And so we need to think about what we really mean when we try and individualize these societal issues and the implications of doing so. So there's that one piece. And then just to sort of touch upon this other piece before my 5 minutes runs out, is the whole concept of apocalyptic futures. So one of the reasons why eco-anxiety happens is because people think of the apocalypse, right? When you think of the apocalypse, you're thinking of these unknown, scary, terrifying futures where we are fighting each other and rabid dogs for food, which very bad at fear. But something that a lot of us don't realize is that there are many of us who are currently living in apocalyptic realities, right? And those people happen to be, in a Canadian context, mostly Indigenous people, but then we also see, Black people living in apocalyptic realities, where there's food deserts, where they don't have access to freshly grown food, where they have to drive, 16 plus kilometers in order to get food, where you have to, it's terrifying to think of these apocalyptic futures, but it's also important to recognize that some people are already living in those apocalyptic futures, right? It's important to realize that there's certain countries where they're purchasing land somewhere else because they know their country is not going to exist in a little bit, and they want to make sure they are able to relocate the entire population to a new location. These are apocalyptic realities. These are not futures that we're imagining. And so that's also the other piece of thinking about eco-anxiety, is to realize that for some people, the apocalypse is already here. And that's why we always have to sort of take in a sort of a justice lens when we approach subjects like this, because we need to recognize the different layers and the different ways in which people are impacted, so we're able to thereby sort of create frameworks to address these sort of very complicated multi-layer issues. I feel like that's my 5 minutes. I'm going to stop. But yeah.
No, it was a well-used 5 minutes. And the idea of powerlessness, and I really appreciate how you were talking about putting the abstractness of climate change into more tangible aspects that we can really tackle. I think that's very helpful. Thank you. Emily, I would like to turn to you if you'd like to take that on now.
Hi, everyone, and thanks for having me here. I'm quite excited to be here today. Yeah, talking about nature, climate, and mental health kind of sits right the square of many issues I care about, particularly when I work on the climate justice and the climate nature movement. I think the issue of well-being, I think many of my colleagues will probably can tell you that I try to bring it up a lot in meetings. How can we do to check on each other, how we are doing, how we can prioritize our well-being, but also prioritizing the work we have to do. It's something that we always keep in mind. I'm trying to push for, but sometimes it's easier said that done, and that happens a lot of times because unfortunately, out of young people, particularly in the climate justice movement, in the climate nature movement, sometimes it's really hard to balance having our own lives, having some pleasure and time off without feeling guilty or feeling we should be doing something else because of things happening so quickly. I think there's been a lot of discussion about this and about eco-anxiety. So I want to touch a bit more about the issue of mental health for those who come into the climate movement, having like mental health conditions or issues, or like being or identifying as neurodivergent. I think that's something that is always underexplored because on the climate movement, a lot of times it's of justice, and we include talking about gender justice, we talk about land justice, we talk about racial justice, and disability justice is an area that's just getting in there, and we can link there as well, considering people who are like neurodivergent. I think that a lot of times these people who come into the climate movement, who often already have and live with different ongoing chronic mental health conditions. On top of that, then they have to experience the same anxiety and the same guilt and the same fear and anger that the rest of the peers feel, and that can be like an including double burden for them. And a lot of times the climate movement, this is not considered, both when it comes to like doing action on the streets, the type of actions we can do. Some young people might not be able to get in, might not be feeling good enough or not feeling confident enough or like safe enough to be able to join marches on the street, for example. Or some young people might struggle a lot when we are at the big conference like the COP26, for example, the UN climate change conferences, and you have to be there with so many people around you, and it can be like a really stressful environment in which you never really get the rest. And that's something to think about, that the movement for climate action and for climate justice is often not necessarily the most accessible one. And a lot of times this issue of like justice and accessibility might not be considered as much as other areas to be considered. And obviously this then impacts and make the issue of climate anxiety and eco-anxiety, which is already bad, even bigger for those who experience those two big burdens. And I think here what has been really important in terms of like doing something about it is trying to have and create a supportive community, a supportive network in which we always try to check in on each other, and we try to prioritize well-being over everything else. That means sometimes if we don't make things on the deadlines we want to make them, we have to take a step back and be like, okay, it's fine, I'm just going to lean on my team and keep going. So I think that having that supportive network, as I do at Yale for Nature with like so many young people who check on each other, we support each other, we have calls now and then to see how we are doing, is really important. I think that has been really important for everyone who's working on any type of activism or movement, because how we sustain ourselves is sustaining. The only way we can sustain ourselves is basically sustaining our community together. So because the well-being of one impacts the whole group dynamics. So that support is really important, and working together and checking in on each other. And also another thing that particularly I work in is storytelling, which I really like storytelling as a way of engaging in climate action, because it really gives young people and everyone in this space time to like just sit down and reflect, okay, this is my journey into climate or biodiversity, this is the work I'm doing, this is the impact it has had on me. So like time to pause and to just reflect. And that helps you to reflect on all the fears, on all the anxieties, all the motivations, while you are doing this work, which sometimes can be very negative. As we saw as a fair mentee, there was a lot of like negative words, but then when you go to the end of your story and you're thinking about the work you're doing and what you hope for the future, you will start to feel better, like more positive, and then you will be able to see your resilience much better. That's why I particularly like working on storytelling. And now recently, Youth for Nature, we launched our story map, and I've been the person who has been updating it. And actually, like right now, there's so many difficult things going across the world. So it's been really hard to have this positive mindset, but just reading young people's stories and all the work they are doing in such hard conditions and with challenges, but still having that hope, that motivation to still act despite all the adversity, really like inspires me. I feel more empowered that you are not alone, that you are a community, even if it might seem invisible, that is working together for these things. So yeah, I think that for me, those are the main things I wanted to make around mental health and climate and nature, which is one, these people on the space who already come with having mental conditions, and they how they can be better accommodated in the policy process, as well as in like street demonstrations and other types of action, is really important and must be brought into the forefront when we discuss eco-anxiety, because it is a double burden for them. And then to the importance of like community and having tactics that are more self-care oriented, like storytelling, with give us a bit of a pause and we can reflect on our work, on our learnings, on our challenges, but also like trying to celebrate and be happy about what we have overcome. That's really important as well to maintain our good well-being collectively as a community. So I think that's all my contributions for the panel.
Thank you so much. So many good points there. And I really loved the highlighting of you know, the solidarity of the activism network and how it's important that is to support each other and that network and what that provides. Yeah, thank you so much. George, I would like to turn to you now to kind of round up our speaker section, please.
Wow, thanks so much. I'm lucky I get to go last because I can just echo all the fantastic points I've heard. I really love connecting diverse youth with nature, combating the individualization of climate action, power of storytelling, so many things I've heard have been so great. And my particular lens on this topic is also a youth lens, and my work with Be the Change Earth Alliance in British Columbia is focused on empowering youth aged 12 to 18 to learn more about and take action on climate justice and other topics. So I want to start with a story. I will always remember the words that a student named Natalie wrote in a letter to Vancouver city councilors urging them to take bold climate action. And it was her birthday, the day of when she wrote this letter. Today I turned 14, she wrote, but instead of celebrating with my friends and family, I'm here asking for my future. I want to live and grow old and have a family, something that shouldn't be a luxury. I think this letter really emphasizes the profound mental health burden, the eco-anxiety, the climate anxiety that many youth are experiencing today. And although I think youth experiences are extremely diverse and multifaceted, I want to highlight something I've observed, which is this profound dissonance that I think youth are experiencing between, on the one hand, the reality that they observe that climate change is happening and their futures, their presents are in grave jeopardy. On the other hand, between the world that adults seem to be living in that denies this reality, that denies the science and the facts and the consequences and the gravity of this problem. And so for young people, I think it's really troubling when adults are supposed to be the protectors and the caretakers and the mentors, that they don't seem to be able to understand the emergency we're in. And I agree with other panelists that this can really lead to a state of helplessness and hopelessness and paralysis for so many youth. So I want to talk about 3 ways to potentially combat that paralysis. And one is hope. So I think that youth do not need any more fear-based doom and gloom messaging on climate change. Rather, I think our young people need to see taking climate action as a way to build the kind of community and society and world they want and that they imagine, a more just world, a more sustainable world, a more equitable and inclusive world. That's exciting. That gives me hope. And that allows me to act based on hope rather than fear. The second point is agency. So I think for so many kids, especially those under 18, you feel as a young person that you don't have power. You have to wait until you're adult to have power. What can you do right now? And I just want every young person in the world to feel more powerful, because you have agency. It's evidenced by so many youth leaders and climate strikers around the world, but raising your voice and telling your stories can be incredibly powerful and can help lead us in this transition to a more just society that we need. And my last point is around connection. And this is where nature ties in. So building on what Chuk said, I do think we live in a really individualistic society where we think of ourselves and our contributions in just that way, as individuals. We also think of ourselves as separate from nature and disconnected from other people and non-human beings and the natural world, when the reality is we are profoundly interconnected with each other, with nature. COVID has shown that the human family is connected. And I think when it comes to climate action, the individualistic lens doesn't quite work. We need to not ask, how can I contribute in a small way, but how can we collectively work in community to build a more just and sustainable world? And that's how we combat eco-anxiety, coming together in community to take action based on hope.
Thank you so much. Yes, based on hope. I love the hope theme also threading through, especially in light of so much doom and gloom narratives, as you were saying. So, thank you, George. And with that, there's so much to unpack there, and there's so many points and so many issues being explored today. So I want to open up to some question and answers that we can kind of explore with our panelists and these issues moving forward. So folks can put their questions into the question and answer, the Q&A tab that they see there. So if you have questions, please enter it there. I do want to start off, as we wait for questions to come in from the audience, I do want to start off with a question, and I will direct this question to Chuk and Maxime first. I just want to ask, what for you are the key links between mental health, nature, and climate action? What do you see as those key linkage points there? Chuk, maybe if you want to go first, and then Maxime.
Absolutely. So the key linkages between nature, mental health, and climate action, I find it's a really interesting question because it's so large and we've got such a limited time. So I'm going to try and hit on things as best as I can. But it's kind of as Maya was mentioned during her intro, nature has many benefits for human health, both emotional, mental, physical, and spiritual. That we know across many studies. But what's really fascinating is the amount of benefit we're able to gain from the environment is directly linked to our connection to the environment. So if we don't feel a personal connection with nature, we don't get that many benefits from being in nature as we would if we did feel that personal connection. And so you've kind of got that piece there. Then many studies show, but this is also sort of common sense, that when people feel a connection to nature, they're more likely to try and protect the environment, which I think is also really powerful because that demonstrates that almost trifecta, because we're gaining so much from the environment, because we are using the environment, not necessarily using, but because the environment is able to put us in a state where we are more at peace with ourselves, we then want to give back and protect that environment that has helped us center ourselves. So just to sort of highlight this really fascinating study that came out of Harvard, one of the reasons why we believe that human beings feel less stressed in nature is because of the fractal patterns in trees. So essentially the way branches are, shaped or whatnot, apparently that touches upon a primordial part of our brain that makes us feel like we know where we are. And so we automatically relax because we know where we are, versus when we are in city landscapes, we tend to always be overly stimulated, right? We're always sort of taking into consideration what's going on, what cars are passing by so we don't get hit as we're crossing the road, who's calling us, what's going on, like always sort of go, go, go. And seeing a tree actually relaxes us immediately because our brain is like, oh, I know what that is. I know where we are. I think we're good for a hot second, which really sort of helps. And so all of that to say, finding your own way of connecting with nature, I think is incredibly important. And, I just want to sort of highlight that I recognize that we have branded nature in a way, right? When we think about someone who's outdoorsy, when we think about an environmentalist, sometimes we have an image that comes to mind. And if we don't correspond with that image, we sometimes feel like nature is not for us, or the environment is not for us. I went through a period of time like that as well. And so I just want to sort of highlight to anyone listening that nature isn't human beings, right? Nature doesn't judge. And so it's entirely up to us to find our own way of being in the environment, our own way of connecting with the environment. And then also sort of recognizing that there's many of us who have intergenerational trauma related to the environment. So, Black people, for example, the environment has often been used as a weapon against Black people, whether it is, in the days of slavery through sort of cotton picking, whether it is in the days post-slavery, where if you were in a place that had a lot of green space, you're more likely in danger, versus if you're in a cityscape, you're more likely safe, versus, the ocean and, lots of Black bodies dying in the ocean because of the transatlantic slave trade, or whether we even relate it to the dehumanization of Black people, right? We often see Black people compared to monkeys, to gorillas. We saw that happen with Michelle Obama. And so we're often terrified of being associated with animals. So we tend to stay away from the environment to demonstrate our humanity. And so that adds that additional barrier to connecting with nature. So all of this to say, the links between nature and mental health are really fascinating, really complicated, because at its very core, nature is good for human health. But the symbolism we attribute to nature can sometimes harm us as we try and connect. And so instead of taking that journey and recognizing that it's a journey and that you're not going to go out to a park tomorrow and be like, whoa, connected, it'll take you time to figure out what makes you uncomfortable in green spaces, what makes you comfortable in green spaces, what do you want to do? And then in forming that bond, you can find your own authentic way of acting for the climate, because acting for the climate is not always the marches, right? Acting for the climate takes many different forms. And the form that your activism takes depends on the connection you form and the powers that you hold in your life. So that is me.
No, that's great. Thank you. That answers well. Maxime.
Thank you, Chuck. That was really a well-rounded review of the subject, and it was so interesting the way you brought it. As you said when you started talking about it, it's such a complex topic, especially since we don't have studies that can answer these specific questions. We know for sure that there is a link between eco-anxiety, our relation to nature, our civic engagement when it comes to environmental issues, but we don't necessarily understand exactly how things are interconnected. However, we know that connection to nature is a strong coping mechanism when it comes to dealing with our fears, our anxieties, with regard to climate change, with regard to anxiety, stress in general, which is why we've been seeing in the past few years, few decades, more and more focused approach on greening of urban spaces, which has become more important because of all the beneficial aspects that come with it. And then, we also know that somehow all of this, through our relation to nature, it empowers us and it gives us roots. We feel like a sense of belonging, a sense of place, a sense of caring for this nature that we want to protect more and more. But the relationship is much more complex than that. There are so many nuances and it can relate to many things, but there is that sense of, through our connection to nature, we learn to care more about it, and through that care and that thought we have, we feel like we want to protect it more and get more and more engaged. So
wonderful. Thank you so much. I think that answers that question very well, and rounds it out really well. Thank you. Maya Rose, I want to turn to you next. I want to kind of add a question that we had prepared, and also a question from the chat here. I just wanted to ask, what are some nature-based solutions or actions that we can leverage to nurture our collective and systemic well-being? And then I'm going to kind of connect that with what is one piece of advice you would have given your younger self, maybe growing up, thinking about these issues, about mental health and climate and nature work. I want to kind of fit in one more question for both George and Emily, but if you have an answer for that, to explore that, that would be wonderful.
Yeah, of course, and I'll try and be efficient with my answers. I think in terms of nature-based solutions, there's so many different directions that you can go in that, and I think that's kind of the joy of it. Like, it doesn't have to be one thing, and in fact, I think it works far better when you have various nature-based things going on at the same time. But in terms of the one that I'm personally a fan of the most, I think that rewilding is actually going to be incredibly important, both in terms of solving or helping with various environmental issues and with trying to reconnect more and more people to nature and dealing with some of those mental health issues. And sorry for people who don't know, rewilding is literally just the concept of restoring landscapes to how they once were. And so Black to Nature's run various events this past year, but the ones that have been by far the most effective have been various tree planting days that we've run, where we've just been getting kids out of the city, out of very urban areas, and bringing them out and just letting them plant trees, which is a very, very visible, I suppose very tangible activity in terms of going out of your way to help the environment and help environmental issues. So I think there's loads of things like that, people from local communities and things like that. I think it is sort of a double-pronged approach where you're helping people feel like they're helping with the environmental issue and with a problem that is mainly very systemic and very difficult to fix, and you are doing a little bit to deal with environmental issues as well. But I'm sure that if you asked everyone that question, they would have a different nature-based solution to answer that with. And in terms of what I would go back and tell myself, I was like 11 or 12 when I started nature campaigning, and I never thought that it would become such a big thing. It was pre youth strikes and Greta, and I think the biggest thing I tell myself, which I think is actually a very big lesson for lots of young activists today, is just to look after yourself and to I suppose think about your own mental health and your own well-being and your own eco-anxiety, as well as trying to go out and save the world. I know so many amazing people, amazing young people in particular, who have just cared so much about the environment that they have just completely burnt out in their efforts to solving it. And so I think I suppose another aspect of the whole mental health issue is making sure that people are looking after themselves to make sure that they can do the best that they can do to help with environmental issues.
Thank you. Wonderful. Thank you so much for those wonderful answers. Really insightful. I'm mindful of time, but I wanted to quickly get a question into Emily and George. And then I wanted folks to know that after that, we are going to have Kristen play back the illustration, the time-lapse video. So I just want to let folks know that that will be happening, and we will also be offering up some resources after that as well. So the final question that I just really quickly want to pose, Emily and George, is about storytelling, because I think that touches on both of kind of your areas of work. And how do you envision storytelling to help drive change in regard to today's issues? So how is storytelling really helping to drive change? Emily, we did kind of touch on that already. And so if you just want to expand on that quickly, and then George as well. So Emily, if you want to go first, and then George, we'll come to you.
Yeah, thanks so much. So I think how we see storytelling as good for nature, we say storytelling is not the end. So we don't just want young people to tell their stories, it is the means to an end. So the stories are powerful devices and examples of the change and mobilization understanding that we need across the climate and diversity movements to be able to tackle the climate and ecological crisis simultaneously. That means that storytelling doesn't end at just letting young people tell their stories, but also it is about giving platforms through which young people can then access different resources and opportunities, which will allow them to grow. and to particularly work better and have more resources and support to run their initiatives on their local communities or regions. And then the hope is that through more storytelling, then their work that they're doing on the ground, their successes, the learnings, and their challenges can be shared with wider audiences who might be motivated and inspired to follow that work or to scale up their own as well. So it's like a change reaction in which by sharing one story, it's not just about sharing the story itself, but it's about empowerment, but also empowerment that comes with like resources and with actual support, and then it comes with the learning and excelling that learning and exchanging that knowledge. So that creates like a good network slash community in which young people are supporting and motivating each other through storytelling. But I think the most important is that it doesn't end in selling the story. The stories are powerful, but the power comes from like being able to like actually add to that stories, to grow them, to resource them better, and to make sure that young people feel supported. And that links really good with like the well-being theme, because one of the biggest stresses that people might face in the climate emergency movement sometimes is a lack of resources due to different injustice and inequalities that goes from like race and gender throughout disability to like age and intergenerational inequity in particular. So resources are really important, and then that support that is material as well as obviously that having holistic approach also considers well-being. So seeing storytelling as a means to an end, but not the end, is really important. And trying to support and resource young people through their storytelling journeys is key to support not only and sustain not only the climate movement and nature movement, but also like to be able to sustain young people themselves as individuals doing this work. So that will be my thoughts on that.
Wonderful, thank you so much. George,
I'll just add one more thought, which is that human beings are moved to take action by emotions and by stories. And storytelling is a way for us to move the public, shift our culture, and that is needed for the bold transformations that are essential.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. I know that was a quick, there was so much to cover there, and the issues are broad. And I really do thank you all for showing us the interconnections of them and weaving them together in really important ways, and highlighting the many, many different ways we can think about these and bring them into our lives and think about them in our communities and actions and systems. I do want to turn to Kristen really quickly to offer us a chance to see the conversation that we've just had in a visual artistic reflection. So Kristen, if I can hand it over to you for a replay, a time-lapse replay, if that's possible.
Yeah, thank you. And I guess if I'm spotlighted, that's great too, just so everyone can see it really well.
Yep.
This is going to go fast, just like our conversation, but I wanted to start by highlighting some things that came up in the polls and then moved into different elements from speakers. And it was really powerful to see how the responses from our participants today really connected as well with what everyone was sharing as well from their work and experience. So there's a real balance in the conversation between understanding the challenges of eco-anxiety, as well as trying to share what are the benefits of connecting with nature, and some challenges as well related to privilege and accessing nature, and that some of these feelings resulting from eco-anxiety and action and makes you feel powerless and guilty, and there's some grounding in racism as well in that. Appreciated some of the conversation about prioritizing your own well-being and building a strong network that you can work with and learn together and also celebrate together. Some of those solutions we talked about were hope and connection, and even just the power of learning to be comfortable yourself in nature. And that too is a type of action that's important. I wove in some leaves there near the end to try to highlight the concept of rewilding, and then ended just saying that stories are important and it moves us to act. Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I look forward to seeing that, the finished piece there, to really look at all the details there as it's reflected back to us. Thank you so much. And so I am mindful of time, and I thank you for all your extra minutes here. Time is precious. And so I want to thank all of our inspiring speakers, Maxime, Myros, Chuck, Emily, George, for your time, for your insights, for your knowledge, and for your inspiration. for your hope and optimism, looking forward in our actions. I would like to thank the partners at the British High Commission to Canada, and thank you to the High Commissioner for their opening remarks today. I would like to thank the audience for your time, for your thoughts and feelings in our earlier exercises. And I know you're joining us from across multiple time zones and regions today. So thank you for being a part of this community interaction and this collective climate momentum that we're doing. Again, a sincere thank you to Kristen Elko of Elk Community Planning and Design. I would like to thank Rachel for their unwavering tech support today. It would literally fall apart without you. So thank you from behind the scenes tech support. Lastly, I wanted to direct you all to some climate community action resources that we've developed for you for this event. This resource offers links and connections to various climate, community, and well-being actions and initiatives. So it's broken down into different categories, different areas, different issues. And so it's a starting point. It's not everything, but if folks are looking to get engaged, if folks are looking for different actions, here's maybe a potential starting point. We've also created a bit of a fun kind of climate and community action card. It's kind of like a bingo card idea that folks can use as a fun way, informal way, in a creative way to get engaged with friends and community on issues of climate, nature, mental health, and community well-being. That is also in the chat as a link. And then lastly, we have a survey. We do take these surveys seriously. We read them all because they do help us help you and think about the types of issues we're addressing and what we're bringing into the community space to help expand climate momentum and community building as well. So if you'd like to fill in that survey, we are most grateful. And so with that, thank you so much. Thank you to the speakers and everyone involved. We are so deeply appreciative of your actions and your knowledge and sharing with us and spending time with us today. So take care, be well, be kind to yourself, let yourselves feel some hope and joy and optimism for the climate momentum that we built today. So thank you. Much appreciation. And I think the panelists are getting all sorts of thanks.